Ethics Untangled is brought to you by IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. To find out more about IDEA, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. Today, I'm talking to Professor Lisa Herzog, a Professor of Philosophy at the Centre for Philosophy, Politics and Economics at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. The subject is time. Not in the abstract, but how much of it we have and what we might choose to do with it. We start by discussing whether people in general are lacking in free time. And then we move on to why it might be important to try to give people more time. Not just for their own health and happiness, but also because of the costs to society and to democracy of people being too time poor. At the end, we get onto some specific policy measures that might help. First of all, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Brilliant. The first question is quite a basic one, I suppose. So I just wanted to ask, so are people in general lacking in spare time? Is that really the case?
Well, that's what they say to sociologists in surveys. So I'm not an empirical scholar myself, but what I read is that there is quite a strong sense that people lack time. And what's interesting is that it's not only poor people who historically have often lacked time because they needed to work very hard to make a living, but that also quite privileged people say that they lack time. And you might still ask, well, is that because they really lack time or because they want to be busy because there is something, it raises your status if you're always busy or important and so on. But historically, it was a sign of privilege that you had leisure and you had other people working for you. Right. And we've moved away from that quite massively. That's interesting, historically speaking.
That is an interesting difference. Yeah, I hadn't really thought of it in those terms. So is that the case then, that at least the way people report their lack of spare time, that there's a difference historically between the way even privileged people now seem to lack time, whereas in the past they didn't. Yeah.
Yes, and you see differences between countries. The US is quite extreme. In many European countries, you have far more mandatory holidays per year, and there are maximum working hours per week. But as a general pattern, I think many people suffer from the fact that historically the kinds of jobs that we had were for men who were providers for family, and then they had a wife at home or partner who would take care of kids and the household and everything. And we've moved to a model where women would also go into the labor market. But the question of who does all the work at home has actually been left unresolved, sort of. And that's an old complaint of feminists. But despite it being old, I think we really haven't tackled it in many societies.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. Yeah. Your point there kind of raised a question about gender inequality, right? So I was interested in that question. So is it the case that women on average are more time poor than men, or is there a difference there or not?
I mean, one thing that I remember from reading the empirical literature is that single parents are among the most time poor group in society, and single parents are very often single mothers. So that is definitely a difference. Other than that, you also get a lot of variation by social class and by country and so on. But single parents really stand out, and that's a gendered thing.
Yes, okay. And what about social class? So, I mean, as you said, like it seems like there's less of a disparity now than there would have been back in history. But is there a difference between how much free time poorer and richer people have?
From the top of my head, remember any studies that would point to exactly that? It seems to be that in many societies, there are also social norms of what are you supposed to say? And we seem to have a pretty generalized sense that it's not okay to have too much time. So you're seen as a slacker, someone who's, parasitic on others. So I do sometimes wonder to what extent some of these surveys fail to capture things that are hidden behind these social norms.
Sure.
But the historical pattern, as I said, is really this astonishing shift that even if you are quite comfortable and you could translate some of your money into free time, lots of people either don't do it or don't want to talk about it because it's a kind of taboo.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? I mean, it is striking how much kind of pre-meeting small talk is about, oh, how busy everybody is, right? When you kind of meet somebody on Teams or whatever, everybody's always going, oh, how are you? Oh, I'm really, really busy. You very rarely get anybody saying, great, I've not really got much to do, to be honest.
No.
Just kind of
And I mean,
lying
for
around.
a
Yeah.
previous project, I did interviews with practitioners on ethics in their professional life. And I very vividly remember one guy a bit older who said, yeah, there is now this expectation that you're always 100% on. But if you're always 100% on, and you never have these phases where you're just 80% on, how can you do the phases where you need to be 150% on?
Right.
So he had a view that it's normal that
Yeah.
you have fluctuations. Sometimes it's 80%, sometimes it's more than
Yeah.
100%, and sort of averages out. And that sense that there is a kind of, you know, a mix between more hectic and more relaxed phases,
Yeah.
that's not so much something you're supposed to mention, at least, anymore.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's really interesting. And it sounds like the kind of empirical picture might be a bit difficult to be really clear on, but is your sense that things are getting better or worse? So are we more time rich or more time poor than we were, say, 100 years ago or 200 years ago?
It depends so much on where exactly you're looking in society.
Yeah.
One new thing is, and that's of course widely known, is the sense of always being on, thanks to digital media and having your smartphone at home, and always being able to check your emails, and
Mm,
so the boundaries between work and
mm,
the rest of your life seem to be more blurry, and some
mm,
people don't mind this, and in some jobs it's also maybe less of a problem, whereas other people really struggle with this. But then of course you're the same person, and often you cannot switch off your mind, and if you have a problem in your private life, you'll think about it in your work time, and the other way around. If you have a problem at work, you might think of it as about it at home. So in that sense, this idea of like those very clear boundaries, this is work, this is life, I'm not sure whether this has been ever completely true, but this
mm.
blurring, I think, contributes to the sense that you have to be always on, always, you can always be reached by colleagues if something's happening, and that is very stressful and also changes the subjective perception of time, I think.
Yeah, that's no doubt right. So I mean, I'm actually speaking to you from my attic, right, at home. So I'm not I'm in a kind of space that's sort of designated a workspace within my home, but it's still within my home, right? So the kind of yeah, the boundaries are a little bit blurry there. It's our spare room as well as being where I tend to do my work. Yeah, whereas in the past I might have been in the office or out of the office, and therefore there was a really clear distinction between those two spheres of my life. And that kind of suits me, but it's definitely true that it does blur the boundaries. And as you say, technology is another element of that, and the way so much more of your communication for work and non-work is done through your phone. And you have I might have the work Outlook app alongside the
Yes,
Gmail app. So, you know,
indeed, yeah.
there's no clear distinction between the different sorts of messages that I'm getting really in that kind of way. So I think that's right. It's probably more true actually of some kinds of jobs than others, right?
Yes,
So obviously
definitely.
some jobs you can do from home, and some jobs do involve more of that kind of communication. And so it's probably more of a tendency in those jobs than others. Yeah. Okay. Great. So what you're interested in then is the way in which a lack of free time might have a negative impact on democracy. So that might not be something that people might immediately think about when it comes to free time. So, in what ways might a lack of free time have an impact on democracy?
Yes, thank you. That is indeed a question I've been thinking about a lot. Let me start by saying that you can also raise questions of justice about free time. What is the
Mm,
distribution of free time? Who has what kind of free time, of what quality, how much, and how does that fit into other distributive patterns that we have in our society? So that is already a very interesting discussion. But
mm,
then on top of that, there is a question of how do we actually make time in our lives to be citizens? And
mm,
it depends a bit on the picture of democracy you have. So some people think of democracy as something that matters roughly every 4 years or in between for local elections, where
mm,
you go to vote, and then someone else, the politicians, do all the political work. Now, if you have that picture of democracy, then the question of how much people work and how much they have time to think about politics or discuss politics with their friends and family, whatever, that doesn't really matter so much, because what matters is just that people vote and that the politicians do a good job. I think that model of democracy is problematic and doesn't work very well. And I think that for democracy to be really stable and to flourish in the long run, you need citizens to be more actively involved. And one thing is really the informational side of things. You need to be a good voter, you need to understand what's going on in politics. You need to understand which party is actually aligned with your own values and interests. You need to understand a little bit, okay, what kind of things have happened, what kind of scandals, are they responsible for something that happened, like an economic downturn, or was it some other factors? So the whole idea of being a good voter, even in this very minimal sense of being a voter who understands which vote best tracks their own interest, already requires that you
Yeah.
can get informed about politics. But if you then also think that citizens should also get active in civil society organizations, in their communities, should be members of things and do things together with others, then this whole question about, well, do they have time for that, becomes very, very salient. And I think one of the problems is that when you're time poor and you never have this experience of doing things together with others, with your fellow citizens, also with others with whom you might not agree politically, you're more likely, and this is me speculating, I haven't seen studies on that, but it would be interesting to study that empirically. But I think you're more likely to fall for simplistic pictures of politics as us versus them, or demonizing certain other groups. And if you're so exhausted not to be able to think through it or develop empathy for the other side, then it's just easy to go with the slogans. And there are lots of slogans out there you can go with if you're in the tired and exhausted state of mind.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I suppose there's maybe a couple of separate points there, aren't there? So there's the
Yep.
point about kind of the ability to sort of engage in democratic debates or kind of activity that contributes to civil society, whether it's on a local or a national level. And I guess probably a lot of this is local, right? It's the kind of
Well, yeah,
local action that loses
on
out.
the one hand, yes. On the
Yeah.
other hand, I've just read a really fascinating book
Ah,
by a fellow Scotchball. It's called Diminished Democracy, and it's about the history of US civil society. And I
right.
didn't actually know this before, but historically, lots of these seemingly local activities in the US, the Tocqueville praised, all these local
Mm,
clubs and so on, many of them were actually integrated as chapters into broader, ultimately nationally based institutions that had a kind of federalist structure. So you'd
okay.
be in the local chapter of some civil society organization, but
Mm,
there would also be communication and feedback with a regional and then maybe a national
mm,
organization. And so the local concerns could also be taken to the centers of power. And on the other way around, there could be a connection, sort of feedback from what the speakers of these communities would experience in the centers of power and go back to more
mm.
local people. So I think that is a very interesting thing. And
Yeah,
but
yeah.
Scotch Paul also argues is that we've sort of, or in the US at least, this has been replaced to a great extent by more managed top-down organizations where you don't have that kind of active membership base.
Right. Okay. I suppose that my experience of that kind of process it is, most saliently as being a member of a political party, right? So
Mhm.
I don't know how it works where you are, but in the UK, yeah, we have these kind of big national parties, but those national parties have a kind of branch and
Exactly.
ward structure, right? So you have these kind of local
Yes.
meetings where you kind of get together with
Yep.
people with kind of broadly similar sort of
Yes,
political views and so on,
I
and you
think
have
lots of
those
parties still
debates.
function this way. Yes, and
Yeah,
it's also a
yeah.
way of, recruiting people into roles and so on.
Hmm.
But what Scotchwell argues mostly is that in civil society organizations, that has gone down. But
Mm,
that's all US data, and
yeah,
I haven't seen research. That's maybe me, and maybe this research exists on other countries and how this functions there. But it
yeah.
is exactly what you're talking about, that, do you have the time and the energy to go to a meeting in the evening and to go there regularly so you can build trust with other party members. And
Yeah.
is there time in people's lives for these kinds of activities?
Yes. Is one element of this the way people being time poor might kind of skew the extent to which people from different parts of society are involved in these kinds of discussions, right? So it's not just that overall there's less of this stuff going on, but it's also that where it is going on, it's disproportionately involving the people who do,
Yes,
the general point notwithstanding, have a reasonable amount of free time. So kind of classically retired people, right? They might have
exactly.
loads of free time and they're able to go along to these meetings. For example, if there's a kind of local consultation on some building works or something, something that people who work in local government have said to me is that you do these consultations and what you get is hundreds of responses, almost all from retired people, because other people just don't have the time
Yes.
to.
And I think
And
that
there's
that is
obviously
a
nothing
problem.
wrong with that perspective, but it means that other perspectives are being
Exactly.
thrown out. Yeah.
Yes, and sometimes you get interesting constellations where you get young people who are not yet in work and family life, and
Yes.
retired
Right.
people, and those can be interesting groups to be brought together. And sometimes,
Yeah. Yeah.
interesting things can happen between those. But of course, there's a whole gap then when it comes to people in the middle of their lives, and that lack of representation, I think there is something unhealthy about this.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, good. So that makes the point, I think, quite forcefully. Yeah, I wanted to ask, what changes might we make then in order to give people more free time so that they can contribute to these kinds of activities?
Well, this may sound a bit naive, but I think ultimately what we need is work time reduction, but work time reduction not as a voluntary thing, where you say, okay, I get a lower wage and I work less, but really as a mandatory thing for all members of society without a reduction of wages.
Mm,
And I think it's interesting that historically this has been always an element of what unions and also other professional associations fought for their members, work time
mm,
reduction. And it's gone away for a while and it's coming back in some places here and there. And there's
yeah.
also an interesting discussion, which is a bit separate from this more sort of union-based discussion about a 4-day work week.
Mm,
And there have been various empirical studies that were quite positive in the sense that insofar as people who could concentrate their work in 4 days instead of 5 days did actually experience it as quite a good way of organizing their work, also not increasing pressure in the 4 days too much. My
mm,
worry with the studies is that they make it look almost too easy in the sense that not all kind of work can be done in 4 days instead of five. And for certain jobs,
mm,
you will have to hire more people if you offer a 4-day work week. And so I think those were studies where companies would self-select into participating in the studies, and then you
mm,
probably get the kind of companies where this is realistic. Um, but if you think about all the potential for technological progress that we have through AI, and I'm not a huge techno optimist, but I think
mm,
we'll see increases in productivity. And then there is a real question of how do those get distributed?
mm,
And do they get distributed to everyone in society? And if so, then one form could be work time reduction for everyone
mm.
um, over the long run, as instead
Yeah.
of increased income, which is also important. And there's a whole range of questions about justice of wages, of course. But I think time distribution is also something we need to think about when you think about, okay, we are going to be more productive in the future, but who benefits and in what ways?
Yeah. It's interesting. I suppose, like when you think about kind of what has to be in place for those changes to be made. On the one hand, like you say, there do have to be the kind of increases in productivity, or at least the sort of, yeah, it needs to be demonstrated that a reasonable level of productivity is achievable within a reduced amount of number of hours. Right, on the one hand, but then on the other hand, you do also need something like trades unions, right? Because otherwise, the upshot of that is just going to be that we'll work the same hours and we'll produce more, but we won't have any more free time, right? So you were saying kind of historically, it's trades unions that sort of fought for a reduction in hours, right? So people were working much longer work hours, say in the 19th century, than they are now, and to a great extent, the reason for that is because of unions fighting for workers' rights, right?
Yes, and also in international comparison, I mean, there is a striking difference between the US having turned higher productivity in the last decades into, on average, higher wages, although they're still stagnating compared to corporate profits, and many European countries cashing out that increased productivity in terms of reduced working hours. And one explanation that economists put forward is that it has to do with unions, and not only in the sense that unions directly fight for reduced working hours, but also in the sense that unions want to keep people in employment. And to do that, reducing work time, but then keeping everyone in, has been a strategy that has often been applied in economic downturns. And
That's
that meant
interesting.
that in many European countries, you ended up with far higher gains in temporal autonomy for the average worker, at least if they
Right.
are in a unionized setting, compared to the US, where union density is just so much lower.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought of it in that way. I suppose another element of it might just be cultural, though, right? So it
Yes.
might just be that in the US, there's just it's that kind of norm that you were talking about earlier of everybody has to be very busy might just be very much stronger, right? So it's less
Well,
acceptable to kind of,
Protestant work ethic on steroids, as some people
yeah,
have
exactly.
described it.
Right.
Yes, and also kind of, this idea of meritocracy, that your income or your status in your job says something about how good you are as a person,
Mm,
which has been criticized for many reasons,
mm,
among other things because there's just no one-on-one match between good people and where they end up in jobs.
yeah.
But also, um, I mean, it sort of, it gives people who work very hard and then earn a lot of money a justification for thinking or rationalizing that their high income is justified.
Mm,
Whereas if you become richer and then you work less, you might ask yourself some questions about what on earth gives me that privileged position. Whereas
mm,
if you feel so stressed all the time, you're so busy, then it's easier, apparently, and there's psychological research on that, it's easier to rationalize that you really deserve your high income and there should not be any taxes on it and so on.
yeah. Okay, that makes sense. Great. Okay. So that's a suggestion of what changes we might make in order to give people more free time. And one of the things that I guess you would like people to do with that free time is to engage more in kind of volunteer work and community work and so on. And this is the kind of point that you raised yourself in the paper that I read. But is this like David Cameron's Big Society? So that's what it
Well,
might remind
I
people
was
of, right?
worried that people might think it is like
Yeah,
this, but I and I want to delineate my proposal from that. So
yeah,
the big society idea was very much, let's get volunteers to do things that the state did in the past, like take care of the elderly or what have you. I don't want to say that state services should be reduced. It's an independent question of what the state should do,
mm,
and we shouldn't answer it just by saying, okay, there are people available or not.
mm,
And it's also different because of something that we discussed a bit earlier, namely this big society vision, which has resonances in other conservative thinkers. It often is very much a kind of apolitical and localized
right.
picture of community, very sort of organic, as people don't like to call it.
Mm,
Um, and the kind of activities that I have been thinking about is not of that kind. I mean, if that's what some people want to do, I think,
mm,
we have to be liberal about what they do with their free time, but
yeah,
it doesn't have to be exclusively that. And I'm also very much thinking of things like, as you mentioned, political parties,
mm,
unions, um, the local chapters of national institutions. So I'm not thinking of it as an apolitical, just
mm,
local thing where people are rooted in some community. It should
yeah,
also be open towards different kind of groups. And ideally, it would bring together groups that do not meet each other in their working lives, because
mm,
working life is pretty stratified in many respects. So you have, I don't know, lawyers have other lawyers as colleagues, and the cleaning has been outsourced, and the catering has been outsourced, and so we don't have these integrated companies anymore where you'd meet people from all walks of life in your job. It's very
mm,
much sort of fragmented and fissured is the technical term for that.
Mm.
And so the potential for community work, as I'm imagining it, could also be to bring together people who would not otherwise get to know each other and exchange
Yes.
perspectives and think about politics from the perspective of the other.
Yeah, good. Let's just put a slight pin in that because I want to come back to that. Yeah, just to kind of illustrate that point about this not being like the big society. I suppose one of the ways of illustrating that might be just to kind of acknowledge that some of the associational activity that you're talking about might be, as you say, not apolitical and actually precisely agitating perhaps at a local level for example, increased public spending on various services, right? So
that could be part of it, yes,
and
indeed.
that would then be the opposite of the big society because it wouldn't be a kind of rolling back of the state. It would be engaging with decisions about that kind of thing. Yeah. As you kind of alluded to there, one of the other values of this kind of process for you would be that it would also bring people together from different walks of life, different backgrounds, maybe different kind of values even, or political views. So could you say a bit about why that would be a valuable thing?
Yes. So I mean, this is something that lots of people have been thinking about. How do we decrease polarization? How do we get people to see the other as an individual and not just as a member of a group and so on? And one of the most prominent proposals that you see in the literature in recent years is that you hold mini publics. And mini publics, that's the idea that you basically draw people by lot from all parts of society. You get them together, you have a moderator, and they deliberate, they discuss, maybe they come up with some kind of policy proposal.
Right.
And it's all a very cognitive process, and it's all about talking. And of course, some people are better at talking than others. And I think there is something about practical activities that makes it easier for people to actually get going together as a team, to bring different kinds of capacities together. So some people are good at talking, but other people are good at just sort of getting things started and moving things. And so I think often the kind of embarrassment and the sort of weirdness that you have when you sit together and you're supposed to talk to each other, but you don't quite know how, you need a moderator, that might be less of a problem if you have a concrete task together and you really have something to do and you need to figure out something. And having a problem that you need to address together can also create a bit of a group feeling. And I think all of these things for me are arguments for thinking that it doesn't have to be an either or, but instead of only focusing on getting people to talk to each other, we could also think about, okay, where can they do things together? And usually they would then start talking to each other as well, but it wouldn't be in this kind of artificial setting. And it would start from just the concrete things that you do. And then maybe people start talking about politics, maybe not, but it's a different level of encounter. And it speaks to other registers in people's character and people's abilities than just the cognitive thing that you get when you have a deliberation.
I suppose that also contrasts favourably with the way political debates often are played out in society at the moment, because actually it strikes me that there's kind of no shortage of people talking to each other about politics, really, in a way. That's what a lot of people spend a lot of their, what free time they do have doing, but it's just that it's not necessarily done in a particularly productive way, and it's often online. You're talking to somebody who you don't know and who's anonymous, and you don't even know their name. You can't see that, you're not looking you in the eyes and so on, and it's done in a very kind of adversarial way. You get kind of people from one side, picking an example, the worst possible example of the opponent's argument, and everybody joins you in kind of ridiculing them and so on. And that's kind of how these debates play out. It's not particularly productive. Whereas what you're recommending is, firstly, it's kind of, I take it it's, or at least would quite often be face to face, right? So or at least even if it was done virtually, it's with people who are identifiable and are clearly kind of, you can see them as real people, right?
And you would expect to see them again because it would be locally or through some organization.
Yes.
So that is a different setting than these anonymous shouting boards on the internet. And also, you could get to this kind of stance where you say, look, I hate your politics, but you were great in doing just that. And that's also a kind of, mutual respect. And democracy is not about agreeing on everything and
Yeah.
all loving each other. It's also about learning to live with people who have very different views on things and thinking about what
Mm.
does it mean to compromise? What does it
Yeah.
mean to respect them as fellow citizens, even if we find some of their views despicable? So
Yeah.
it's those kinds of things that I'm interested in and where I think joint work can contribute something.
Yeah, and you might think that that's going to work better as well when people do have a concrete problem that they're trying to
Exactly.
address, right? So it's not just kind of going over the old arguments again. It's kind of, well, what are we going to do about this, right?
Exactly.
And then people have to, people might bring very different preconceptions about it to the debate, but you're able to see that at least you're both engaging in a kind of question which you're trying to achieve something that's kind of valuable, I suppose. Right, so that sounds fantastic. But I wonder if there are some ways in which we might think that that's a bit of a utopian way of thinking about what would happen even if people did have more free time, right? So I suppose one question might be, well, would we really have people coming together from different backgrounds in that kind of way? Might people not just choose to spend more time with people like them, right? And so you wouldn't have that kind of
Yes,
cross
that
fertilization
is
or
definitely
something.
a worry. I mean, I want to say first that I think it's one of the tasks of philosophy to think a little bit utopian, at least in the
Mm,
sense of providing possible direction or horizons of, okay, how could the world be differently? And so in that sense, I mean, I'm not a very much of a utopian person, but I think we
mm,
need to have these open horizons, let's say.
sure.
But the worry that people would just hang out with people who are like them, or that they would just have any, they might prefer some very passive activities. And of course,
Mm,
and there are many industries out there that would just want to keep them passive and
mm,
sell products to them. So I think it would probably require some, nudging and incentives in the sense that there are good opportunities for doing it. So here's
mm,
an interesting thing that I recently read about local politics. And local politics is to some extent one of these forms that I'm thinking about,
mm,
namely that in lots of communities, in local politics, you don't have any money to spend anymore. And so
mm,
what you do is fighting about scarcity instead of doing something productive where you can really
mm,
also see results. And the argument that this author made was that this really turns people off and leaves them frustrated, and they had nice ideas and they couldn't realize any of them. And so I think sometimes you also need to think about, okay, what kind of resources could we offer to support that a little bit, and sort of
mm,
make some funds available that people can do something with together, and
mm,
maybe also, I don't know, provide some tax incentives for, people who do a certain amount of hours per year in that kind of work get some kind of tax benefit or something like that. So I
mm,
think, and it's also a matter of public discussion. But once you have activities going, that I think they can also develop a kind of dynamic of its own because people come to like the community and come to like the agency they can have in these kinds of spaces. And
mm,
I mean, it's the same thing that you get in many sports teams, that the community matters. And it's 5 o'clock and you go home and you're like, oh my God, do I really want to go? But then you
mm,
know that there are other people waiting for you. And you
mm.
know that at the end of the evening, you will be happy that you went. And I think that
Yeah,
kind of thing,
yeah,
there's a sort of an initial phase building it up is difficult, but once it has a certain stability, it can also feed on itself and then actually remain stable. So I think the question is often, how do you get into that space?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the benefits of this presumably is just less loneliness, right? So bringing people
That's another
together,
thing. Yes. I mean, we
getting
have
people
a
out of their
loneliness
houses.
epidemic, and this has
Yeah,
been
yeah.
declared a public health issue, even
Mm,
because loneliness is really bad for people. And so I think that could be another reason. And here's one more argument. So you might get back on me and saying, yeah, you're talking about funds and incentives, but that needs to be paid for. And where do we find the money? But I think one of the problems is that lots of the justice and democracy issues that philosophers like to talk about, they actually have costs that you find back in the health system at some point. So, for example, lonely people requiring more medical treatment.
mm,
So if you really did
mm,
a sort of an overall calculation and you took all the budgets together, maybe you'd see that these kinds of activities would actually be self-paying. But it's
mm.
because we have segmented our
Yeah,
public budgets and also the way we
yeah,
think about what are costs, what are benefits, what can fund what.
yeah.
Um, we've fragmented those, and so we don't see all these interconnections very well. And that often leads to worries about how could we pay for this that look very different if you try to get a fuller picture of the costs and benefits that it would have.
Good, yeah. So you've kind of pointed towards some of the specific policy measures you'd like to see. Is there anything else that you think we should be doing, or government should be doing to try and encourage this?
Don't get me started. There's so much. I mean, I think that there are deep questions about the regulation of certain media and social media at the moment, because these companies use all tricks that psychology offers to lure people into, well, as you earlier mentioned, all these unproductive fights, and also fake news or news that come from geopolitical enemies or what. I mean, it's a really problematic picture of the digital public discourse that we have at the moment. So that is and of course it has to do with what people then do in their free time. If they are drawn into this funnel of social media and they're just active there, and so I think these things cannot be completely separate from each other, and ultimately, I mean, there's also a big question about the distribution between public money and private money, and sort of what does a society need in terms of public goods and the public provision of goods, where volunteers can then be part of the picture, and what gets done by private actors. So that, the question of time politics is connected to so many other societal questions. So I've given you a few examples, but one could come up with lots of others.
Yeah. So there's the kind of question about kind of giving people more time. So there's the, think suggestions like a 4-day working week and so on, which, would act to kind of free people up. And then there's questions of kind of public spending and making things available for people to do with that free time that are then productive. But I suppose like one thing that you might think is that the more local people, volunteer, interested people, who with roots in local communities are involved in making decisions about how to use those resources, actually the more efficient the spending might be. So actually you achieve more with the money that you have. So you're not necessarily, arguing for huge increases in public funding. It's just that it's using it in a way that's kind of more productive and more efficient.
Yes, Elizabeth Anderson, who's one of my philosophical heroes, has just written a very interesting paper on the importance of local knowledge. And she uses the Greek terms of metis and techne to distinguish between localized knowledge of particulars, which is often practically based and acquired through experience, versus the kind of scientific knowledge that generalizes and that can be applied top down. And we seem to have forgotten the value of the local knowledge and the practical knowledge, and not only in terms of how it can actually make things more efficient, as you said, but also the joy of applying that knowledge and what it means to people's lives, and sort of doing things together, solving problems together, can just be, an incredibly satisfying experience. And so I think that's also part of why it becomes more efficient, because people really want to do something good if they get the opportunity. I mean, it doesn't always work. Sometimes you get infighting and what have you. So we need to be realistic. But I think there is something about all these top-down programs that don't really reach their targets because the decisions are made at a level that is too distant from the people who are supposed to be the beneficiaries.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Okay. Well, that sounds like a really good note on which to end things. So, Lisa Herzog, thanks very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to Ethics Untangled, a podcast from IDEA, the Ethics Centre at the University of Leeds. IDEA brings ethics to life, blending in-depth theoretical inquiry with real-world experience to address the most complex ethical issues facing the world today. If you like the podcast, please leave us a rating and review. And to find out more about IDEA, including our Masters and PhD programmes and a wide range of consultancy services we offer, go to ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics.